Hi, my name is Ryan Fatamana, and toxic masculinity is a topic that was chosen as the portfolio work. It was chosen because most men has faced the cultural pressure to follow the unrealistic ideal image of what it means to be a manly man. According to one research by Carol Harrington in 2020, toxic masculinity was a term that was coined in the late 20th century men's movements. Toxic masculinity spreads to therapeutic and social policy settings in the early 21st century. In academic and media discussions of masculinity, the term toxic masculinity refers to the cultural norms that are associated with harm to society and men themselves. Traditional stereotypes of men socially being socially dominant, as well as related traits such as misogyny and homophobia, can be considered as toxic because, well, they promote violence, including sexual assault and domestic violence. Boys' socialization in patriarchal societies frequently normalize violence, as in the phrase, boys will be boys, about bullying and aggression. Toxic masculinity is damaging towards both men and women physically and mentally. Throughout the history of literature, traits of toxic masculinity are depicted. Most of these literary works do not have a happy ending or ends in tragedy. It can be seen as a critic or example of toxic masculinity. And we as a society should care and deal with this problem of toxic masculinity that is plaguing our society. In the first literary work, If by Rudyard Kipling, depicts a guide from a father to his son. The poem opposes toxic masculinity traits. The healthy masculinity that was described by Kipling was how his son should remain calm, patient, have high trust in himself, understand people's doubts, encountering people that have different opinions. And he also wrote about how his son should dream and think, but not get so caught up in these dreams and thoughts that he loses his grasp on reality. Lastly, he wrote about how his son must deal with hardships and disasters because it is bound to happen in our lives, even if that disaster it feels impossible. This poem is helpful for someone who had never had a strong masculine figure to follow, such as a father, and it is a beautifully made poem. In the second literary work, Coniferous Fathers by Michael Kleber Diggs, was a poem that are challenging the notion that men and fathers are usually heartless. This is first shown in the metaphor in the title. A coniferous tree, such as pine tree, are not oak trees. This means fathers should always be there for their children, as coniferous trees are evergreen even in fall, unlike oak trees. Clever Diggs portrays the masculine fatherhood role in a more contemporary and modern light. When caring for his children, a masculine father should be gentle, not shy. Unlike the first poem, this is not a guide, but more of an example of a healthy, masculine, and caring father. The third work is Ulysses by Alfred Tennyson. This poem reworks the figure of Ulysses by drawing on the ancient hero of Homer's Odyssey and the medieval hero of Dante's Inferno. In this poem, masculinity is represented by two characters, the father and the son. The father takes more of an active role of masculinity, such as the role of adventurer, explorer, and fighter. This was a common role for Victorian men because they were tasked with exploring the colonies and claiming land for the glory of the British Empire. This role contrasts with that of the son. In Ulysses, the son role is to stay at home and rule the land. This can be seen as a feminine trait and it creates tension. But the tension in Ulysses begins to broaden our view of what socially acceptable male roles. In the fourth literary work, Old Men, by Ogden Nash, depicts the views of our society has on old men. The main idea of this poem is empathy or lack thereof. Nobody feels obligated to care about the deaths of old and elderly men. At that point, their lives seems pointless because they are going to die anyway. The view of masculinity means heartless and lack of empathy is not healthy, and it was shown in this poem. The fifth literary work is The Hollow Men by Thomas Stearns Eliot. He is a modernist author that depicts a desolate world populated by empty and defeated people. This is a direct reflection of the devastation caused by World War I. The horrors of war have plunged Europe into such a deep misery that European culture is withering away into oblivion. This is a direct reflection on the devastating state of post World War I. Masculinity is also in shatters, just like any other things in European culture at the time period. This is a reminder that healthy masculinity is needed. Now, the sixth literary work is Duplex by Jericho Brown. Depicts the effects of toxic masculinity. This poem illustrates the abuse and its impacts to the mental health of the victim. Abuse from his father and lovers lasts forever, no matter how hard they abuse him. Toxic man only exudes aggressive emotions, or other emotions such as compassion and care will not be used because they may appear to be a weakness to them. This poem can also be seen as an awareness of violence and toxic masculinity. In the seventh literary work, My Last Duchess by Robert Browning, depict the horrific psychopathic monologue between the Duke and an emissary. Through the monologue, the Duke is a toxic man. He desires power and control over his wife solely because he is a man with a title and has a name of a duke. He tried everything he could to control his wife, a duchess who is depicted as kind, appreciative, and cheerful. But it didn't work. He cannot control her. So, in the end, he murdered her. And he was proud of it, as evidenced by the monologue. The abusive violence, hunger for power, and control are traits of toxic masculinity that are present in this story, in this poem, and it ended someone's life. In the eighth literary work, Macbeth by William Shakespeare, is a play that depicts the tragedy of Macbeth. Macbeth was an officer in the army of the king. He was loyal at first, but when the witches approaches him and said that he would rule the kingdom, he started to question his loyalty. He was also enticed by Lady Macbeth, his wife, who pressured him to kill the king to get the throne. She pressured him by attacking his masculinity and questioned him as a man. Lady Macbeth can be seen as more masculine than her husband because of her ambitions. She is an example of someone who has traits of toxic masculinity that isn't a man. Ambition is good, but ambition that ends in someone's death is not. In the ninth literary work, Homeland Elegies by Ayad Akhtar, depicts the story of an immigrant son who had difficulties assimilating to the American culture. This is because his family has a conflicting reason on culture. He grew up with mostly women, and it became a support role for his upbringing. He struggled with his father's authoritative masculinity, American masculinity, and its obsession with money, wars, and Islamophobia. He was a Muslim. The main character in this book is fighting toxic masculinity culture that exhibits in his father. Now, in the 10th literary work, Bluebird by Charles Bukowski, was a poem that depicts a man's struggle against his own feelings that he needed to suppress because of how the toxic masculine culture perceived them. It is also interesting that Bukowski was a known misogynist, but his poem was dedicated to give light to people who suppress their emotions, which is mostly men, because they are afraid that the toxic masculine standards would shun them away. According to one analysis by Y. Joel Wong, this seems to happen quite often in the present day as men who do not know how to process these emotions often use substance abuse such as alcohol, drugs, and cigarettes. They also may have depression, stress, body image problems, and poor social functioning. In the 11th literary work, Desiree's Baby by Kate Chopin depicts a time of when women weren't allowed to speak their minds, and they had to follow whatever their husbands decided upon them. The husband Armand was a slave owner, and he was cruel. He only sees his wife Desiree as an object that can be bought with expensive gifts to purchase her way into marrying him. Armand does not seem to truly love his wife, as it was clear in the revelation of his newborn son's skin. The child was not white. He then ignores Desiree and throws her belongings and burnt it. This total disregard or general ignorance of his wife's feelings could be interpreted as degrading her to the level of an object. In the last literary work, Othello by William Shakespeare depicts another tragedy that was chosen in the portfolio. The tragedy illustrates what men do to save their honor and alleviate their jealousness. The male characters in the story exhibit traits of toxic masculinity, starting from Brabantio that felt robbed and losing his honor to Othello, just because his daughter married someone that he does not approve. The second character, Iago, has little regard to the violent consequence of his schemes and his misogynistic views of women. And Othello is himself, for believing someone else that his wife cheated without questioning Iago, as if he believed the centuries-old rhetoric that paints women as malicious cheaters who are plotting against their husbands. He also felt his honor was challenged because he could not control his women, just like Brabantio. The story ends with him killing Desdemona, but after he finds out that she didn't actually cheat, he killed himself. Most of the literary works that was chosen ends in someone's death or a certain violence. Toxic masculinity is harmful as it was evident in these literary works. To summarize, toxic masculinity has existed in our societies for millennia and has been documented in literature. There are critics of toxic masculinity, as it was shown here, but in some literary works, such as If and Coniferous Fathers, they are guides and examples of the healthy masculinity. We can understand the impact of toxic masculinity and how to avoid it after reading the literary works. We can also acknowledge the effects of toxic masculinity because of this. We must change society for the better because everyone is affected by this, and one of the ways is to read.